Hello, Andrew Day.
Hey, Bob. Happy Earthling Day.
Happy Earthling Day to you, Andrew. We just got an issue of the Earthling out, the Friday edition of the Nonzero Newsletter.
It's another Earthling with the quality of doneness. Just objectively, it's done.
There's no denying that fact. And we always have to cite Fred Barnes, formerly of my colleague at the New Republic, for that phrase. It
It's a
has the
great phrase.
quality of doneness, he used to say about pieces he had done.
And I would say it's another, not just a done issue, but a very good issue. And it's on some topical issues that we're going to discuss today. That's what this is. This is Earthling Unplugged, where, the Earthling is, as you said, the Friday edition of the newsletter, the Nonzero Newsletter on Substack. And then sometimes we record this Earthling Unplugged special podcast episode of the Nonzero podcast and talk about items from the Earthling. Usually we talk about some topical issues, maybe in domestic politics, but I think this time we can just jump right into the lead item because, as I said, it's pretty topical. And that item is America's out of control client states. So this week brought more reminders that the U.S. is better at arming and emboldening its client states than controlling their behavior. This has been something of a theme on Earthling Unplugged. I think we even had an episode titled like America's Superpower Client State at one point. And that problem was very much, vividly on display this week. The client states in question are, of course, Israel and Ukraine. And Israel has been out of control in that, one, Prime Minister Netanyahu has reportedly, behind the scenes, been obstructing a ceasefire agreement. And Biden has been pushing for a ceasefire agreement. And two, Israel's military has been engaging in very dubious, some might say dastardly behavior in its treatment of detainees. And then on the Ukrainian side, of course, there was the invasion of Kursk in Russia. So quite a stunning development in the Russian war on Ukraine. Ukraine invades Russia. That's obviously not an inherently bad thing. Ukraine was attacked. They're fighting back. But for reasons we'll talk about, I guess, it may suggest that Ukraine goes further than Washington would like it to sometimes. And then the other Ukraine story, of course, is we got more evidence this week that Kiev was behind the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline back in September 2022. At least there was some reporting to that effect, most prominently from the Wall Street Journal. So we can talk about that. The more I think about it, I'm a little skeptical of some of the details, but maybe we'll get into that. But Bob, Israel and Ukraine, which of these out of control client states would you like to talk about?
Well, it's funny. I kind of feel like right now, both in the Middle East and in the Ukraine-Russia vicinity, there are wars that could get kind of suddenly larger. I feel that much more strongly about the Middle East. The Ukraine war just got bigger with the Ukrainian incursion across Russia's border. And that's an example of something that Ukraine apparently didn't give us a heads up about, even though we're providing all the arms. We've expressed skittishness about them using certain kinds of arms within Russian territory. You would think they might have asked us how we felt about that. But that is still that seems not as explosive as the current situation in the Middle East. Although I think long term, that's probably bad. What's happening in Ukraine in ways I want to get into. But in the Middle East, it's a case where we could suddenly wind up in a regional war with Iran. And when you were mentioning, these are both examples of us arming what are technically in international relations terms called client states, because we do the arming and they are much smaller than us. And yet we don't seem to get a ton of responsiveness from either of them in terms of kind of doing what we'd like. And in the case of Israel, there's one other thing I'd mention, in addition to things you mentioned, and it's fundamental, even though it's a little further in the past, which is the kind of sharp escalation in the conflict with Iran that Israel undertook by virtue of assassinating Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas leader, in Tehran. Mm-hmm. Pretty much guaranteed to bring a retaliation, as Israel knew. And that's another thing they apparently didn't give us a heads up about, much less ask us for, to actually approve it. And that's a case where we will almost certainly get drawn into, in some sense, any war with Iran. And so you'd kind of think it would have been nice to check. But anyway, we now have these two situations, very different. And I mean, maybe we could talk about the Ukraine thing a little bit in terms of, well, first of all, why did Ukraine do it? Theories differ. I think it was to some extent just an impulse to change the narrative. The war's not going well for them. But at the same time, that makes us dangerous because they are withdrawing troops from what are already very tenuously held battle lines in the Donbass, especially to fight this. Russia doesn't seem to have yet withdrawn as many troops to deal with this. And so Ukraine seems to be making itself more vulnerable. And that would seem to be bad for Ukraine. I mean, another reason Ukraine may have in mind is if they plan to hang on to this territory, it could be a bargaining chip when, if and when negotiations happen, which they could maybe swap for some territory that Russia occupies. But I still think this is going to put such negotiations further off into the future. It's just Putin's going to, one way or another, respond. People, as we know, I've heard a lot of people who know Russia pretty well say they think this will almost certainly help Putin's recruiting, which is what he needs right now. And that could ultimately work to Ukraine's disadvantage. But anyway, I think however distant peace talks may have seemed, I think they are now more distant. This is just going to add a whole new chapter that has to get played out.
Yeah, I can see that because Putin, are you thinking Putin he doesn't want to go into negotiations from a position of weakness? So that's one reason that this might push off negotiations. I was going to recommend that we talk about this in terms of the pros and cons from the Ukrainian point of view, because I do think that there are pros and cons. This might, I guess it's interesting because you're making it seem like that is a con, and I guess that's right. Because I was thinking of kind of humiliating Putin as on the pro side, like a positive that comes out of this, because
I don't know. It seems to me that 25 years of humiliating Putin got us to where we are today, but that's another story.
No, definitely. And he might want to lash out. But this was a very substantial military operation, and it's the first invasion. Ukraine has kind of done stuff inside Russian territory. And there's been some raids that have crossed the border, but this is on a whole other level. It's actually been a little difficult to find out how many troops are involved here, but it's a substantial amount.
Thousands.
So so this maybe even up to 10,000 or something. Initial reports were saying hundreds, but it's more than that. This is the first invasion of Russia since Hitler invaded and, Operation Barbarossa. And that really does, I think, implicate the legitimacy of Putin's regime. I'm not going to say that his regime's going to collapse and the walls are closing in, because we've heard that many times before, and I don't want to participate in that discourse. But this is so fundamental that I think Putin probably needs to be careful in how he handles this. But you're right that humiliating him could have negative repercussions.
Well,
and you're right that this is a good recruitment measure. Russia was increasing payments to new recruits because they're having a troop shortage. Actually, not to the same extent as Ukraine, but they need more troops to maintain their positions in the east and to advance as far as they want to. This might help with that because a lot of young men are going to see that their homeland is being invaded, and they might feel called to
definitely
defend it.
Look, I think you're right that it humiliates Putin in front of his home audience. The question is does that lead to behavior we're going to like? I think that means he's got to, in some sense, escalate now. And, either move heaven and earth to get these troops, the Ukrainian troops, out of Russia, which will mean killing a lot of Ukrainians probably. or doing other more dramatic things, hitting more cities with missiles more indiscriminately or something. I mean, I don't think the nuclear threat goes up that much. I mean, I think, as we say in the newsletter, whenever the probability of nuclear war goes up by a fraction of a percentage point, it's worth thinking about. And this definitely does move the situation closer to what is justified under Russian nuclear doctrine, what justifies the use of nuclear weapons, because it's now a threat on Russian territory, and so arguably a, quote, existential threat to Russia as their nuclear doctrine has it. But still, I don't think that's going to happen. But I just think the war is bound to, in some sense, get bigger. And I think ultimately, I mean, again, Ukraine can't win this war realistically, right? It's like they are running out of people. Yeah. And in a way that Russia is not. I mean, Russia may be having some recruiting problems because they don't want to resort to a draft. But I think this may solve those problems, and not just through making recruiting easier, but maybe in justifying an actual draft. In any event, Russia's just got a lot more people who can join the armed forces. Now, if you want to come up with an optimistic scenario about how this plays out, I guess it could be, well, this is not the one Ukraine would choose, but one thing I'd say is that, Russia is making progress in the Donbass. And this seems to be, if anything, accelerating that. And, the thing about the Donbass, of the kind of the 4 provinces that Russia claims it has annexed and that it has some significant number of troops occupying, the 2 in the Donbass are the ones that are kind of dearest to its heart. I mean, they had the highest number of ethnic Russians to begin with who were disenchanted with Ukrainian rule. There was probably the most indigenous support there for the Russian invasion and so on. So you might say, and it's the part of Ukraine that Ukraine's probably, if it has to let go of something, it's probably happiest about letting go of, precisely because of that composition. So you might imagine a situation where, this war's probably not going to end until Russia controls all of Luhansk and Donetsk. Maybe this accelerates that because Ukraine is relocating its troops. And meanwhile, it gives Ukraine something that you can use to bargain for parts of the other 2 provinces.
If they can hold on to the territory. That's a major caveat. If they can
hold on to the territory. And again, I don't know. If they can't, I'm not sure I see the point, because they're going to lose. They're already losing troops and equipment there. I mean, it's but they're going to lose. If they try to hold it and fail, they're going to lose a lot.
Yeah. And humiliating Putin isn't the only ostensible positive that's actually connected to a negative. I mean, a lot of people, when they're talking about the positives here, mention that the invasion of Russia, this offensive, will force Russia to divert troops from the front lines in eastern Ukraine, which are apparently kind of collapsing, in a gradual way. But that obviously has a corollary, which it diverts Ukrainian troops and Ukrainian material as well. And these are, as I understand it, they're well-trained elite forces. They didn't want to send a bunch of scrubs into Russia.
Right.
This is a difficult
Whereas
operation.
Russia is sending a certain number of scrubs to counteract this. And, the other thing is so far Ukraine's getting the worst of the deal in terms of manpower diverted from the what was previously the battleground. And still is. I also heard somebody noting that, in terms of Ukraine holding the territory, and this was a Ukrainian veteran talking about this, who's very sympathetic to Ukraine and the war effort, but saying that, the way the technology has changed the war, making life hard on occupying Ukrainian troops is not as hard as it used to be. It's like, you establish one setup with these first-person view drones, and you torment the Ukrainian troops and assets with them. And by the way, Ukraine is now in a place where they don't have access to Starlink. Their communications are much harder. They have to use means that are more readily, compromised and eavesdropped on by Russia. And Russia had already been having electronic warfare success against like Ukrainian drones and so on. So anyway, it's just, this person was also saying the terrain here favors like counterattack and insurgency. It's not like wide open fields. It's like hills and forests, where the people who know the territory can be lurking.
Mm-hmm. So they're exposed to ambush, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it's forested and if it's very densely forested, that could be an advantage in terms of drones, like that drone issue. But
yeah.
It's kind of hard to say. I don't know how the offense, because military analysts always talk about whether the offense or the defense has the advantage. I mean, in this case, it kind of seems like they went into like undefended territory and did secure it, and not in an insubstantial amount. I mean, everything's
they
relative,
caught him by surprise for sure. It was a well done thing.
But I guess they have to think, and I guess you can't really say they are now playing defense there. Like they're still kind of on the offense, because when you think about their like supply lines and stuff, I mean, they're an invading army that's probably pretty vulnerable. I'd say another possible upside that you hear, and I don't know if this is to some extent trolling, is that this could create a buffer zone, which could make missile attacks from Russia more difficult. I say it's possibly trolling because sometimes people have said that Russia wants to make all of Ukraine or Eastern Ukraine into a buffer zone. So it's kind of interesting to hear the Ukrainians say that about Russian territory. Any other down?
Well, the other upside here from Ukraine's point of view is it's a huge morale booster for the soldiers and the populace, because they had just been taking a beating. And so that's good. And conceivably, it could aid a little in enlistment in the Ukrainian army. I mean, right now, there seems to be a fair number of young guys who spend their time evading the draft. But it just seems to me like, in retrospect, it will probably look like it was just like a mood elevator. It worked for a while. I don't see how it solves the long-term problems, but it's a wide open situation, and it is less scary to me than kind of what's going on in the Middle East, where I mean, I get the sense, I had Josh Landis on the podcast, and he said, like, a while ago now, a couple of weeks ago, like, Iran, there's a lot of reasons not to retaliate. I mean, they've got to, like, not at some level want to retaliate because aside from the kind of feeling that they have to demonstrate their retaliatory capacity and look tough in the region, it's all downside. There are lots of reasons just to let Israel pursue its present path, which isn't working out well for Israel, and not interrupt your enemy when you're making mistakes. So I'm not shocked that Iran still hasn't retaliated. But you'd think, I mean, the experts say that if the hostage negotiations don't work out, if the ceasefire negotiation doesn't work out, and it looks like it's not gonna, and Iran can't kind of claim they got that war-ending deal instead of retaliation, it seems like there's still a lot of pressure on Iran to retaliate. And it's not that easy to imagine, given the way they retaliated last time, which was with non-trivial military force that was fairly ineffectual, arguably because they wanted to kind of tip Israel off and it not be too ineffectual. I don't know. But given that that's where they're starting from, it's not that easy to imagine a retaliation that's not of a magnitude that risks wider war. But who knows?
Right. Yeah. Like the kind of strategic logic involved here would seem to necessitate an attack on a grander scale than that. I mean, they already kind of broke the taboo against directly attacking Israel, and they must feel that they have to go beyond that. The Landis point was interesting. In last week's Earthling, we had a transcript excerpt in which he was talking about this. It's kind of Napoleon's dictum, I guess, not to interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake or something. And then people should go watch the whole episode. I thought that his explanation kind of underplayed just the role of American deterrence here. I mean, we expanded our military footprint in anticipation of a possible attack. I think Iran they probably do have the strategic consideration in mind that Landis mentioned. I also think they're just scared of the United States and of Israel because a war could go very badly for them. Should we talk in a little bit more detail about the ways that Israel is an out of control client state? Because the ceasefire agreement that you're mentioning, that people are starting to think, and Iran has hinted, and the White House certainly seems to think that a new reason to urgently get to a ceasefire is that'll make it so Hezbollah and Iran don't attack Israel. One thing we learned, and there has been reporting on this in Israeli media, but the New York Times did some reporting on how Netanyahu has been adding new stipulations. So he was saying that he wasn't hardening Israel's negotiating stance. It's like bargaining position. But behind the scenes, he was actually adding different stipulations to ceasefire proposals that were kind of throwing the negotiators and the mediators and stuff sort of off balance and making a ceasefire less likely. It seems like he's doing that because the continuation of his government depends on it, because he has some far-right forces in his government who say they'll collapse the government if there is a ceasefire. But
plus, as long as there's a war, apparently he gets to stay in power. I mean, that was at least what people have been saying from the beginning, is that, after October 7th, okay, Netanyahu is to blame for this, and he will have to lose his job, but not until the war is over. And so that in itself gives him an incentive for war to just continue. And there's now serious talk of Israel launching a preemptive kind of war against Hezbollah. I mean, there's already kind of robust exchange between the two, but there's talk about escalation on that front. So as a political matter, leaving aside what the far right part of his coalition is demanding, it seems to me it's probably in his interest to just keep wars going as long as possible.
Yeah, they were also saying, they were considering a preemptive strike against Iran, and apparently a majority of Israelis supported that idea, or something like close to 50% maybe. I thought it was sort of darkly humorous. It kind of reminded me of how people talk about Iran's nuclear program and supposed desire to seek nuclear weapons, because we don't actually have evidence that they want to do that. It's just kind of an inference. We're like, well, they're surrounded by us. We're really threatening to them. Presumably they would want a nuclear weapon in this situation. And I think it's kind of similar in this case. It's like Israel attacks, I guess you can't say they attacked Iran, but they attacked inside Iran, in Tehran, the capital.
Yeah.
And then they immediately think, oh, Iran will probably want to respond to this. We need to preemptively attack them to defend ourselves. The other Israel issue that we write about in the newsletter is there is some Haaretz reporting about this. That's an Israeli newspaper. There had earlier been some reporting by Al Jazeera about this, but I didn't know about it. And apparently Israeli forces, with the knowledge of like high-ranking military officials and commanders, they have been kind of dressing up detainees, including civilians. In one case, as young as 16 years old, they've been dressing them up in IDF uniforms and sending them out with their hands bound to test Hamas-controlled structures and tunnels and stuff for booby traps and to see if there's armed militants there. There have been cases where there were armed militants who shoot the detainee, and the Israeli forces know, okay, there's Hamas there. This is a particularly kind of gross and disturbing form of human shields. We usually hear that in reference to Hamas, but this definitely seems to count.
Yeah, it's different. I mean, Hamas is accused of doing it in a more kind of aggregate way, just having their forces stationed amid civilian populations, which is a pretty predictable thing. That's the way it's going to work in a situation like that, where you can't have military bases. You're going to be in cities and population centers. Now, I mean, the accusation is they go further and locate specifically in hospitals. But yeah, this is different. This is more retail than wholesale, I guess you could say. But if that's not too gross a way to put it, but Haaretz is it's kind of the New York Times of Israel. So this is a little different from first of all from Al Jazeera reporting it from an Israeli point of view. Although I'm sure there are Israelis who, just as Americans are skeptical of the liberal elite New York Times, are skeptical of Haaretz. But it seems like a pretty well documented report. It made it sound like a widespread and accepted practice that top Israeli officials knew about. Yeah, it's not good.
And Haaretz a month ago, in early July, I think it was, they had a really good report that people should read about how Netanyahu has been kind of subtly behind the scenes sabotaging ceasefire proposals by selectively leaking certain information to gin up opposition to any potential ceasefire, and making it seem like Hamas's response to Israeli proposals was more negative than it actually was, so that he could blame Hamas for obstructing the process. The last thing that we haven't talked about in terms of out of control client states is this Nord Stream situation. Can we move on to talk about that?
Sure.
So a couple things happened this week. I don't know. I don't really understand the timing or if it's just a coincidence, but there was reports in Swiss and German media that German prosecutors, basically the German government, is seeking the arrest of a Ukrainian man over his alleged involvement in the bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines, which connect Russia to Germany, and they're very, controversial natural gas pipelines for that reason. And we already knew that Germany was investigating Ukraine in this matter, and it seemed like they suspected Ukraine. But this was kind of an escalation of that, because they think this guy actually dove into the seabed and planted the explosive devices on the pipelines. He has so far evaded arrest. Earlier, I was going to say another potential positive related to the Kursk invasion is maybe it makes Western governments more likely to keep the flow of military weapons and support flowing. And I wonder,
I think that is part of the aim, is for Ukraine to give its supporters a sense that victory, in some sense, is happening somewhere on the battlefield.
But this new reporting would potentially counteract that positive effect. I mean, you have to imagine this is going to piss off Germany. I should also say that the Wall Street Journal, they reported that basically this small sabotage team of Ukrainians went out in a boat and blew up Nord Stream. And they say that Zelensky approved the operation, but then when the CIA found out about it, he told his commander-in-chief, who at the time was Valery Zaluzhny, who is now the ambassador to the UK. But apparently Zaluzhny, according to this report, pressed on anyway and told his general under him to keep going, and said it was kind of out of his hands, as already in motion. That's the part that I find a little too convenient about this, and kind of
for Zelensky, you mean?
Yeah.
The plausible deniability?
Yeah, he has a problem with Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny is an ambassador to the UK for a reason. It's kind of a demotion for a military guy like him.
Zelensky finds him politically threatening. I think he dumped him as was he was the commanding general of the war, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I think that's true. I mean, it's convenient in two senses. It's Zelensky saying it wasn't me. I tried to do what the U.S. wanted. And it's Zelensky saying the person it was is a political enemy of mine. So so that part, I have no idea where the truth lies there. As for the broader claim that Ukraine blew up the pipeline, anonymous American officials had been saying that for a long time, even though I don't think we ever officially said it. And various kinds of supporting evidence have come out. I mean, initially it sounded like an unlikely story, because it was like, Just a few guys in a little boat, and people were, I think even we ran in the Nonzero Newsletter a picture of the minnow from
Yeah,
Gilligan's Island.
yeah.
Because, that was what they made it sound like. But it sounds like that actually was about the magnitude of like the boat. And
It was this Andromeda boat. We also had included a picture of that. It's this tiny little boat. It doesn't
oh,
look like
really? We know the
what you would
boat. It's
expect.
called Andromeda.
Yeah, to my understanding, yeah.
I would have
Um,
preferred Bodie McBoatface, but whatever.
I mean,
Um,
apparently they did, according to this reporting, there were military guys. They had a bunch of businessmen who were funding the operation, and then they had military guys and civilians who had experience as deep sea divers, and then they included some other civilians, including a woman, to
yeah.
just kind of make it seem like they were sort of out on the boat
Yeah, it's a little
holidaying.
water skiing and uh yeah. So yeah, I mean that's like outrageous. I mean, again, uh you know, the US and other NATO allies are arming Ukraine and they blow up a pipeline whose owners include German companies. Germany's a
Mhm,
member of NATO, by the way, and that provides energy to a number of the members of NATO. I mean,
mhm.
and they just kind of do it. And I mean, one thing we say is, in a way, it's not shocking that client states kind of, don't get away with as much as they can get away with. Because first of all, your interests are not going to be identical to theirs. America's geopolitical interests aren't.
Mhm.
And when it comes to escalation, in fact, escalation makes more sense for both Israel and Ukraine,
Mhm.
uh, probably than it does for us. And I mean, at one level or another, it makes either more geopolitical sense for the nations or more political sense for the leaders, or both, I would say. Um, Whereas for the U.S., it's all downside. We're the ones who could get sucked into this, and we don't want a greater level of instability in either region. Um, so, given the divergence of interests, it's not shocking that you get these kinds of these acts of what seem like misbehavior. But by the same time, as we say, by the same token, maybe we should be careful about how often we just bestow massive quantities of weapons on countries we're not going to be able to control.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, in both cases, there are domestic political constraints here in America that may limit our president's use of what leverage is at their disposal. Probably truer in the case of Israel than Ukraine, but true in both cases. So, for all these reasons, I mean, given that to some extent this is a structural problem with arming states, maybe we should be careful, selective about arming states, or not do it in such large measure or something. And then the other thing we say is, like, keep in mind that this is also true on the other side of the table. We assume that Iran has remote control, level
Mhm.
control of Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, Shiite backed militias, all of their so called proxies, but they don't. These are
Mm.
independent actors that obviously are to some extent responsive to Iran, since Iran is helping to arm them, but they have their own interests and they have some agency. And we can't assume that Iran is behind every dark thing that happens in the region.
And
And
Iran's influence on them reportedly has gone down in the wake of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani that
is
Trump
that right?
carried out.
Yeah.
The Wall
Yeah.
Street
In
Journal
fact,
has
that's our
reported
own
that.
assessment, isn't it? Isn't
Mhm.
that an assessment of U.S. government officials? That,
I think so. There was a Wall Street Journal report about it months
yeah.
ago. I want to add one point about this uh, possibility of getting sucked into a war because the biggest disparity in interest between the U.S. and these client states is they would benefit if we get involved in their wars, and we would not. I
Right.
mean, maybe it's a little more complicated than that, but
Not much.
not much, no. But I think this Nord Stream situation actually can be kind of a consciousness raising situation, or because people seem to think that the way that NATO works and the way Article 5 works is if a NATO country is attacked, all the other countries just immediately, no questions asked, have to go to war against the attacker. They think that that's what collective defense means, and it's not. If a NATO country is attacked, if in Article 5 is triggered, it just means they have to kind of talk about it and consider how they're going to respond to the situation. It just forces them to consider it, right? And obviously, there is a kind of understanding that this collective defense and often will entail, when necessary, going to war on behalf of the alliance. But this is a situation where Ukraine attacked Germany. Like, that's what happened.
Right.
And so Article 5 should be triggered. I'm not saying we should go to war with them,
that's what this anonymous German official said, right? He said we could have triggered, or it just would have been kind of awkward since we would have been fighting a country we're arming and a country that supposedly is going to join NATO in a year now.
Yeah. And, that part should be automatic. Like, when a NATO member is attacked, it's triggered, and that doesn't mean there's going to be a military response. It just means NATO needs to consider what to do next.
We should have talked about it. Yeah.
So maybe now is a good time to go to overtime. We do this sometimes. It's for easy and members only.
We've been talking for a while. Overtime, as regulars know, is that very special time where what we say is available to Nonzero members. And you can become a Nonzero member by going to the Nonzero site. And how do we put this?
Go to the Nonzero Newsletter on Substack, and then put in your email and become an NZN member today. And then you'll have access to all the exclusive audio content, all of the paywalled written content, of which there is a lot.
And it costs literally less, okay? Especially if you get the annual subscription. It costs literally less per month than a single cup of Starbucks. I'm not talking about some kind of macchiato, frappa, whatever. I'm talking about just coffee, okay? We're just talking coffee.
Yeah.
Grande coffee, one of those a month will cost you, I believe. Do you know what those cost now?
I think they're $7.
Oh my God. You should subscribe twice. With that, So it's this amazing thing. You get to support what it is we're doing at Nonzero, which is doing our darndest to save the world. And making, I think, real progress. Don't you think things are looking up in the world? I don't sense any volatility.
Well, it's kind of like with the COVID vaccines. It's like, imagine how bad things would be if we weren't here.
Should we paint that picture for them? A world without Nonzero? Folks, imagine a world that there's no world, okay? It's gone. Smithereens. That's where we'd be.
We also get a little spicier in overtime than we're willing to do in the public part. And maybe as kind of a teaser to get people to get the Nonzero membership on the Nonzero Newsletter on Substack, I think I'm going to say something that might embarrass you, Bob, in front of your family members.
Bring it on. If it'll bring in revenue, I'm here for you.
Okay, so if you want to see that humiliation ritual,
this is scary. I really don't know what's coming, folks. This is drama. Shouldn't we save this kind of drama for the other side of the paywall, Andrew?
Yes, we should.
No, I know. I'm fine. I'm fine with it. I mean, I have no insecurities. I'm totally open and transparent with people.
No, this is going to come down the other side of the paywall, which is coming down right now.
This was a free preview of Earthling Unplugged. To unlock the rest of this conversation and other exclusive audio content, become an NZN member at nonzero.substack.com.